Firecast, a podcast from MDM Publishing, brought to you in association with International Firefighter Magazine, reporting to municipal, industrial and fire training professionals.
Welcome to this latest Firecast, where we discuss some of the big issues with the experts in the fire industry. Hello, I'm Paul Hutton, and today we're talking Rescue Ready, the future of emergency flood rescue training. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be delving into the innovative advancements reshaping emergency response scenarios in the face of increasingly frequent disasters, with insights from Scott Shipley, who's Director of Swiftwater and White Water at Calibre Engineering, and EPD UK's lead engineer and director Andy Laird. We'll explore the critical importance of well-trained first responders in swiftwater rescue. I've invited Scott and Andy onto the Firecast to discuss the groundbreaking design of swiftwater training facilities, which simulate realistic rescue conditions in a controlled environment, allowing emergency personnel to hone their skills without the inherent risks of and environmental hurdles associated with training for disasters in real rivers. Featuring compelling case studies like Houston's Storm Range and New York's Swiftwater training facility at the State Preparedness Training Center, we'll highlight together how these state-of-the-art centers are revolutionizing training programs, ultimately enhancing public safety and preparedness in a world where floods have become the norm. So join us for the next few minutes as we uncover how technology and innovation are gearing up the next generation of rescuers to confront the challenges of modern flooding scenarios. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining me on today's Firecast. Why do you think the phrase "the century of floods" resonates so strongly with emergency responders today, Scott?
You know, it's amazing how the perspective on flooding has really changed since Hurricane Helene came through America. It came so quickly and was such a big surprise and huge impact to lives, to property, to the people that live in those valleys that were flooded, both on the mountainsides and in the base of the valley, obviously. And people started to really think of these things as the new norm, right? The Gulf was hot and the hurricane came rushing in. And I think in our future, we see that coming more and more. And that all of a sudden led to a big, I think, shift in the way people think about these things of, hey, we need to be ready for what comes next. And that means preparing first responders, not just along our coastal areas that are historically hit by hurricanes, but in these other parts of America as well.
So, Andy, can you elaborate on the significance of specialized training for first responders, particularly in swiftwater rescue scenarios?
Well, you've got to put the people in the right place with the right kit and the right gear. That's the main part. You wouldn't expect a firefighter to go into a burning building without the appropriate equipment on and the appropriate training. Yet, as a society, when a fire truck rolls up, we expect something to happen. They're going to do something. They're going to make the rescue. And if they're in the water, people are drowning. There's an expectation that people want to go in. So we should be training these first responders appropriately, and they should have the appropriate equipment. They're workers, they're in the workplace. So we have a duty of care as a society to look after them and train them appropriately.
Surely swiftwater rescue training could be as dangerous as the rescue itself. What are some of the risks that trainers and trainees might face?
That's something we say a lot to people who are looking at investing in a swiftwater rescue training facility, is that in traditional scenarios, that swiftwater rescue training in a real river is often as dangerous to train for those scenarios as it is to actually go out and execute a rescue. And what that means is people train in much more controlled environments than what they would actually do a rescue in. And again, Helene shows some dramatic examples of people stuck on hospital buildings or climbing up on the roof of their cars in very active floods. And the question you have to ask yourself was there anything in the training that these folks did? Because for a lot of them, they're 2 weeks in, 3 weeks into being river people, right? They've had a swiftwater rescue technician level 1 or level 2. Are we training them to go out into that very powerful whitewater and get those people back? Because the expectation is that they will. And so creating a training center where we can mimic the power, mimic the level of danger, mimic the the scenarios that are very real life, if somebody's stuck on a car or in a low head dam, but have that off switch and have that control to let those rescuers train. And if things go wrong, turn the water off and reset, or pull them to the side and discuss a better approach and strategies. And so that's the real strength of these Swiftwater rescue training facilities, is that we create an environment that mimics the real world, but that has that off switch and has that controllability of all the factors that make that training so dangerous.
So how does the Swiftwater training facility differ from conventional training environments in terms of safety and effectiveness?
You know, we really hit on it when we built our Whitewater Center in Charlotte, North Carolina, which again wasn't very far from where Helene came through this year. So a lot of the same responders that trained there responded to that disaster. The fact that we have an environment that has, and we build them typically for Olympics, right? Or competitive kayaking or those types of activities where they are looking for very powerful replicated environments. And by putting the vehicles and the training scenarios that we're trying to get people ready for out into that very powerful stream, we create an environment where they're getting swept off their feet, where it's difficult to access a vehicle or where it's difficult to cross the flow, and we're training them how to actually do it in a real environment. If it goes wrong, we can turn that power off, or we can flip on a light switch or things like that. And a lot of the things like, ankle breakers where you get your foot stuck between two rocks, or a strainer or something that might entrap somebody's leg and hold them underwater, we simply remove that from the environment because it's a built environment. And so a lot of the things that could lead to injury or problems in this training scenarios is sort of taken out of that. And we just focus on the main training environment that we're trying to focus on.
I think that's an element that Scott and I really excel at as engineers. We've got the paddling background, we've got the rescue background, and it's that integration and skill set across into a design to produce these simulators in their little packages around these bigger venues. And we're looking to adapt what happens in the real life, whether that's people stuck in a culvert, whether that's people stuck in a vehicle. And our skill as engineers, as design engineers, is to bring that scenario to life, make it as interesting and as exciting as possible, make it challenging, but at the same time, try and remove any real hazards that may be in the natural environment, or at least to educate around those through the process of people coming and training on these venues. That's where we really, really do well.
I was preparing for this Firecast by chatting to a former firefighter who said that in his limited experience of dealing with water incidents, he said what really struck him was just how the water doesn't really have to be moving very fast at all to actually just take you off your feet. So I guess that this sort of training really brings that home to people and gets them prepared. What are the key safety features that you integrate into Swiftwater training facilities to enhance the training experience?
There's kind of two sides to answering that question. And the first one is just the physical things that are there. By creating an environment where we control where there's challenges, but then create areas for recovery. So there's an intense area of rapids and then a pool to recover in. We create an environment in which people aren't constantly just washing off downstream during their training events. And at the same time, when we focus on things like wading and some of those simpler ropes rescues that people will learn in their Swiftwater Rescue Technician level 1 and level 2, we're creating an environment where you can stumble on rocks, but you can't really twist an ankle, right? The rocks are encased in concrete and you stub your toe, but you don't lock that boot in and things like that. We don't have to worry about the natural risks of trees or things downstream that you could be swept into that would be an obvious risk. And so that is very controllable. When you run into things like a vehicle rescue or a low head dam rescue that are very dangerous, we purposely design that training area so that there's oversight and people are able to reach out with a lifeguard book or with a rope or enact a rescue that we can pull those people right to shore, reset and start over again. And then, the kind of nuclear bomb on that is this ability to hit a button and turn off every pump on the site and turn on every light on the site so that when things really go wrong, instead of running around trying to do 10 different things, it all happens with that one button.
that kind of process as well. We've got a huge degree of variability in there as well for the different skills being tested. So it might be just water awareness at the beginning with the lake, or you talked about the different levels of flow and how quickly you can be knocked off your feet. So we can control the depth and the velocity of the water across these venues, whether that's the urban street or in a more of a river-like channel. And that ability to vary it, and also vary it during a simulation and exercise. So we might start with the water around your knees. The rescue is enacted and people start to do what they want to do. But once they get going, we can up the level, we can up the flow, we can up the depth. And then as instructors, they're looking for some leadership. So maybe they've got the wrong tools. Maybe they need to come back with a raft. Maybe they need to stop wading around, come back with the boat. So there's an element there where we're creating a dynamic environment where the rescue is changing, it's evolving as the scenario unfolds. And that often catches quite a lot of the teams out. If it's out on a river, the river's just the same level, they set the scenario up, it just repeats itself. But we've got the ability to change it whilst that rescue is being undertaken.
I want to pick up actually on an interesting point that you kind of just threw in there, where you said you turn off all the pumps and you turn on all the lights. So you're doing training at night. Why is that so important?
One of the things that sort of worrisome about Swiftwater rescue training until now is that it's always done during the daytime, right? And people are always focused on what's the safest way to get this training done. But the reality is that when the phone rings, we send our responders out to solve the problem whenever it happens. And it's often people driving home from the bar and slipping on an icy road and landing in the creek or the river. And you have to go out and get them off that vehicle. Or a Katrina happens and, the entire city's flooded and you're working day and night. And so how do we train these people to be ready to work and coordinate? Because a big part of this is no longer just the rescue with these massive disasters. It's the logistics of coordination and working together with these multi-agency rescues, being able to do that in daytime as well as darkness. And so one of the beauties of the New York site was the addition of lights to that facility, which are obviously off during the training scenarios. But if somebody does go missing, Bob floats off down the river, we can instantly start to chase after and rescue Bob and reset that training scenario with that mushroom button. And so it's a very powerful tool. And really, as far as I know, the first time that people have sort of in a cohesive way started to do a night training scenario.
It can be quite wide as well, Paul. It can involve different agencies at different times in that kind of nighttime exercise as well. And also, if we do have to use that overall kill switch, it's almost like a near miss. A near miss scenario. So there's a lot of learning from that. Why did that person disappear off down the river? And you can go back and say, well, the downstream rescue wasn't appropriate. So you can let things go a little bit further than you might do in a natural training environment where the risk starts to get a bit high. You kind of, right, guys, we've got to stop. This is getting a bit dangerous. You can let the scenario unfold a little more, knowing that there is a little bit of security with that bigger kill switch to take away all the power, bring all the lights on. So yeah, the guy might get washed away downstream, but part of the exercise may be to go and look for him and recover them, knowing full well that if you need to turn all the floodlights on and bring the daylight back, you can.
You talked about starting off maybe with just sort of water up to your knees and learning there, but what sort of training scenarios can you accommodate at these facilities? How does flexibility benefit first responders who will be at different skill levels?
The facilities are designed in some ways to match the curriculum. And so that's a part of the process when we do the programming and as we come into a design of a new facility. It can be different in different locations, but essentially we want to qualify a lot of people for that Swiftwater level 1 technician and Swiftwater level 2 technician. And so the Swiftwater channel itself is designed around that idea of how do we match that curriculum? How do we do the ropes work, the self-rescue, the swims, the traverses, the strainer, things that come into play for those typical certifications. And that's a large part of what people are training to. As they come back for that continuing ed, we start to look at a lot of these very specific things, right? How do you rescue somebody from a vehicle? How do you do the high line and get a boat out and get somebody, either out of a low-end dam or just out of a typical rescue scenario? And so we try and be clever in each of these to bring in unique scenarios that are different to different parts of the world. And we're doing one right now in Houston, and we've we've matched the slopes of the sides to the slopes of all their canals. So they get familiar with pulling people up that same slope that's actually there. And what is the friction on that canal? And what can you walk up and down, or do you need ropes and those sorts of things? When you bring in the urban flood rescue, and I think this is the beauty of that, it was recognizing that a lot of these major disasters, the rescue is actually flood response and not swiftwater rescue response. So how do you search those buildings? What are the logistics of that? We keep talking about multi-agency responses, but you can't go get grandma out of the attic in New Orleans and just save her individually, right? You have to then get her to, quote unquote, lily pad, whether that's a high axle vehicle or dry land, and start to rescue masses of people while you're evacuating folks on the backside. And so how do you coordinate with those high axle vehicle trucks that are coming in and taking people out wholesale back to where it's safe and there's food and medical response and things? And so we try and train for the entire disaster, from the very sort of tip of the spear, which are these swiftwater scenarios that are very dangerous, to the searching and the evacuating and the cutting into the attics and the ropes work that needs to be done to get people off the stairs and out the door and onto a raft and eventually back to safety. And all those scenarios are sort of encompassed in these training facilities.
And a kind of a really neat part that we've learned is that these are training schools. So as we develop each scenario, each rescue area, it becomes a set session. So they'll try and within the curriculum do it in like a module. So they'll move around during the day, set sessions. So maybe two stations in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and then later in the afternoon, and then the nighttime work potentially after that. So we're cognizant of that as designers, that we're trying to produce these sort of individual pockets where the team will work with their instructor, and then there'll be a big shout. They'll go for a cup of tea, a drink of water, whatever, and then move around to the next one in the circuit. And that kind of training college approach, that you're moving around the various areas, is kind of key. And that gets more people through. They learn, they're more relaxed. And there's a kind of a phrase, if you're scaring someone, they're not learning. So within that kind of movement around the site and these different scenarios, we can kind of up the pressure and up the power of the water at the different venues. So it's a really neat way of working, and we're really cognizant that we've got to get people through this. Unfortunately, it's a bit of an efficiency thing, really, but we can train a lot of people, and we can train a lot of people really well, and that's the key.
Looking at some of the things you do, one I picked out on is high axle vehicle operation. That's just another example of some of the training that you give. How does this, let's call it multi-dimensional training, contribute to the overall team preparedness that you find once you've put them through all these things, Andy?
So a number of venues, and more recently we've advanced a kind of driving circuit around for the high axle vehicles. Particularly in Australia, they use the big Unimog vehicles, and that's one of their main assets, and they have multiple units around, and that's one of the first things that they deploy. So we've tried in our venues to make a circuit where we integrate some rescues from windows, from higher stories or rooftop rescues, and then integrate them, bring them out into the vehicles. And then, as Scott mentioned earlier, the kind of lily padding approach, that they would come to an area of higher ground, maybe be transferred via a boat or by different means. But the high axle is something that's pretty common across a lot of the US. Not so much in the UK, but certainly Australia is a big tool that they use. So we need to try to accommodate for those vehicles and how they're used.
There was actually a series of fatalities in Texas at a National Guard training event that they had with these high axle vehicles going across moving flow like this. And so part of what we bring, again, with our controlled environment, is the ability to start to judge for these drivers. Where is it safe to go? What can I cross? What type of flow can I cross? Create an understanding of, is it 6 inches of water? Is it 8 inches of water? How do I make good choices? Because I have a truckload full of people as I go into these floods. And so by finally having a venue where they can start to work on those skills, work together, especially if the water isn't clear, to be able to know that they're driving on solid roadway and getting to where they need to get to, and creating that coordination as well is important. And so this is something I think that adds a lot to, again, the idea of how do we respond to a whole disaster and not just one rescue scenario. It's starting to train and work as a team.
In the intro, I talked about the New York Swiftwater training facility and the State Preparedness Training Center. Tell me more about those and how the project came about and what made it revolutionary.
That's a good question for me. We were the designers there, so we worked for the state, for Homeland Security, ultimately, through the State Fire Service. And they had some very exceptional leadership there. And the guys there realized that they couldn't possibly accept as a workplace that people weren't appropriately trained and equipped. And that was something that came across. The guy couldn't really sit in a court of law and say that he hadn't done everything in his power to train his staff appropriately. And that was the main push behind that project. It's unique in the sense that we have a Swiftwater channel there, which is around elsewhere in the world in terms of kayaking and rafting. But we added this urban flood street at the same venue. So we were bringing in the traditional floodwater skills, Swiftwater skills, and across with actually responding to floodwater where people are in an urban environment. And that's why it was unique. That was the first venue that had the urban street with the variability of the flow, the ability to put vehicles in. We had an overbridge. We've got a number of properties at different heights down the side. We had a ford across as well, so you can drive the vehicles in and out. And that's really why it ended up as such a kind of iconic facility around the world that people look to. And it's kind of the go-to place at the moment. I think it'll be superseded by some other projects that are in design and construction at the moment. But it was certainly the pioneer across the globe, visited by countries and fire services from all over the world.
And Scott, what about the storm range in Houston? What makes that a premier urban flood training centre, and what successes have you actually seen from its implementation?
You know, we like to talk about sort of Gen 1, Gen 2, you know, these early Swiftwater rescue facilities that we're creating were often a part of a whitewater channel that we were building for kayaking or rafting or, you know, kind of our main line of business prior to really getting into Swiftwater rescue. And so when you start to look at the New York project that Andy just referenced, what you're really talking about is instead of having a whitewater park that does Swiftwater rescue, you've just got a Swiftwater rescue training facility. And it completely changes the plot on how we put these things together. So instead of trying to make something safe enough for the average person to raft down and then somehow train on these hazards that you have to sort of cobble together, we're actually building those things in a controlled environment. And this storm project in Houston is the next, you know, we call it Gen 5, right? It's the next progression in that, where we start to look at the entire training environment, a much bigger lake, so that we're working on that lake environment with motorized and unmotorized boats. And then, as Andy referenced, a lot of those basic skills that people want to learn, the swimming, the floating, the wading, and the ropes work before they go up into the channels and have to try those skills in a place where they'll get washed away. We've also taken that main Swiftwater element and put it into two separate channels. And one is more of the viaduct canal. That's the traditional Swiftwater rescue. The other one is naturalized with roughened edges. So it's hard to get to. There's logs in your way. There's, you know, when you go to throw that rope, it's difficult to maneuver through all the obstacles that are there. We mimic things like farmland where the water's rushing across that flat, wide road, you know, to try and teach judgment, right? Do you walk out and do a wading rescue there, or do you do something with ropes or boats because there's a chance you'll be swept into a barbed wire fence or something dangerous like that? And so we've tried to take kind of the lessons learned from each of these different generations and make it better in Houston to create a better environment for training. And that's really what this is the next evolution in Swiftwater rescue training.
What I'm getting from this, guys, is the fact that we haven't reached the end of the road here. This isn't kind of like we've constructed all the facilities we need and now we can just use them. So what advancements do you actually envision for Swiftwater rescue training facilities? What else are they going to evolve into to meet challenges posed by flooding and other disasters?
That's different in different places. And I think for Scott over in the States, the big venue is the kind of way forward there. The all-encompassing giant training college certainly works stateside. Over in Europe here, we're tending to go a little bit more regional, a little bit smaller venue. So more kind of each area, each region might have a kind of a medium-sized or a small-sized training venue and distill down the very essence of the best parts of the bigger the bigger projects so we can use them, and they might be bolted onto a conventional fire academy so that they can then train swiftwater and flood rescue activities there, but also spread out across the country so time isn't spent traveling around between, off shift and swapping shifts over, etc. More on the ground, we're still looking at how we advance our simulators. We're currently looking at a culvert unit, which is a kind of a pipe in the ground. And we've come across a lot of accidents and a lot of incidents relating to pipes and drainage. So one of the simulators we're currently working on is around that, the basis of that, and access and how a rescue might be undertaken there. And we're looking more at kind of different rope work, different cross-agency training involving ambulance, heart teams, and also multi-agency as well. Certainly in New York, there are guys that get drawn in from like forest rangers. They get brought in to deal with flood rescue as well. So it's really heading towards this academy approach of training, really actually working on teaching, evolution, safety, and thinking for yourself out there as the scenario may change, floods may change, obstacles might come down, whatever conditions change. So really trying to evolve the training to be as stimulating as possible. And one of the good parts about our one of the systems that we have, the rapid blocks, which kind of sculpt and shape the water that we have in these channels, is we can move them around. So when the people come back for a refresher 2 years later, the whole environment that they'd previously trained in is evolved. It's different. So where they got into the water last time isn't the same. Where they rigged up the rope last time isn't the same. So it keeps the training fresh, keeps it interesting, and people stay engaged.
We're nearly out of time, but what I want to actually just touch on before we finish is any cases of where you found that improved first responder training in Swiftwater has actually affected the people doing the rescues and the communities that they're in.
I keep coming back to Helene because it was such a deadly and terrible disaster, and so sudden and so violent because it happened in as opposed to Florida or somewhere that's lowland and flooded. It was just this dynamic, terrible swiftwater rescue on a massive scale. And what I found myself doing was just being stuck to the computer because I have friends in the area. I used to live in that area, but it's also 2 or 3 hours from our original training facility in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so realizing that all the people that were out there responding to this flood were trained at our facility, and the ones who had real life experience and trained for real life scenarios were coming from our, by nature of the fact that it's there from our facility. And so realizing that we had that impact, and, traditionally, especially in America, regions will have a swiftwater rescue training team that they can go out and respond to different disasters, and they'll sign on to a hurricane and come in and be a part of the response to that hurricane or that flooding event. But when it happens in your community, what you need is thousands of people that are Swiftwater level 1 or Swiftwater level 2 so that they don't become a part of the problem, at the very least. And hopefully they can start to be a part of the solution with that additional training. And the fact that we have a facility that can sit there, especially now when you look at New York or what's coming online in Houston, and just pump out rescue teams one after the other so that you do have 2,000 or 3,000 people ready and that they are ready to go in and be a part of that solution. That's a huge difference to a community where people are, that only have minutes to respond to something or waiting for hours for somebody to be available to come and help them. And so that's really the power of these facilities is you're not waiting for the prime season. You're not waiting for a sunny day. You're not waiting for the water to be low and all the things that come into traditional swiftwater rescue. When we turn on the pumps, the water runs at the right flow for your training session. And we can do that day and night, day after day, year round, so that your whole first responder network is ready to respond to a disaster.
I'd add a little bit on the positive impact on local communities as well. Certainly New York, I follow the kind of local TV and the local news there when there's a flood. And there's just been some absolutely superb textbook example rescues from what could have been a really, really poor outcome. It's just been superb to watch. The guys have just come in, knew exactly what to do, set it up, got the boat in the water, gone across, picked up the casualties in the house, straight across, back out. It's almost a non-event. And it's been a real pleasure to watch that evolve over time. And that's like the local crews doing what they've learned and really delivering the goods.
Fantastic. Right. Before we go, for our wonderful Firecast listener, if they want to learn more or get involved in emergency preparedness, what steps do you think they should take?
I think the number one thing that we're advocating for is realistic training is the best way to prepare people to respond to these disasters. And when you're asking somebody to go out into that extremely dangerous high velocity flow and do a rescue, you want to know that they've trained for it, that they're prepared for it, that they've set up the safety they need to set up, and that they're taking the best and most advantageous approach. You want them to be that person Andy just talked about, that puts together a rescue, executes it safely, brings that person back to shore, and everybody goes home and has a cup of coffee at the end of the day, right? And that, to get to that level of proficiency in swiftwater rescue, what we really need are these facilities like the facility in New York State, or like the facility that we're building in Houston or Stanley County, that prepares people for exactly that. So we recommend reaching out. We'll help put together a plan for you, whether it's something that's more on the economical side that fits in as an additional training facility to one of your centers, or creating something, bespoke just for what you want to train for in your community. We can help deliver that and create an environment in which you're training your whole department and your whole series of agencies that will respond to these disasters. And so give us a holler and we'd be happy to help.
We're the people at the front end of this. I think we've the most experience across the globe of all these different centers and the scenarios. The number of people that come out to look at the various centers and facilities that we've done is incredible. We've been through that learning curve. We're in the second, third generation of these forces and facilities. We know what works well. We know what works best. We know what's the safest. We know what's the best way to train these people. So why waste that experience and skill that we've built up over the last few years? It's here, and we're welcoming for anyone that wants to come on this journey with us into the next generation.
That's Andy Laird of EPD UK, and along with Scott Shipley of Calibre Engineering. They really do know about emergency flood rescue training, and thanks to this Firecast, you know a little bit more about it too. Thanks you, Scott and Andy, for joining us on the Firecast today. Thank you for listening. I'm Paul Hutton, and I'll join you again soon.
Firecast is produced and presented by Paul Hutton and is an MDM Publishing podcast in association with International Firefighter Magazine.